So following on from that, what do you think? I mean, you're dealing with Jews from all kinds of backgrounds in the work that you do now. What, from your experience and your own journey, are some of the biggest misconceptions that people have about Judaism?
Oh my gosh. So many things. That I think that if you're growing up in a Christian environment, as many of us do in America, we tend to assign we tend to put Christian concepts onto Judaism, and we don't even realize we're doing them. We're doing that. For example, the concept of purity versus impurity when we're talking about Tuma and Tahara. I was recently having a conversation about family purity, which is I don't like the words purity and impurity, but for semantics sake, that the word impure to describe a woman who is currently nida, who's on her period, is just not true. It's not, it doesn't mean that she's dirty. It doesn't mean that there's anything wrong. It's that there's a cycle of potential versus lack of potential. And that's all that means. It's not that, oh, she's dirty because her body does a totally normal thing. It's completely neutral. It's just, okay, right now, there's no potential to create life, and that's okay. And in 2 weeks, the potential will be back. And that's with everything. Tuma and Tahara are always cyclical. I think that I guess the views of gender, especially coming from the Western world, which sees feminine work as inherently less than. So even within, and I call myself a feminist, I identify as a feminist, but even within the Western feminist movement, a lot of it is devoted towards telling women to act like men because of this, internalized misogyny that anything feminine is inherently less than. So being a wife and a mother is inherently less than. Being a caretaker is inherently less than. And we're talking about things like, the pay gap. That's because women tend to, and then people will say, oh, that's because women tend to work in lower paying jobs. I'm like, no, that's because we value feminine work less. So teachers, which are probably one of the most important professions to a functioning society, are paid very little. Whereas, I don't know, Wall Street or whatever, that's more higher paying, that's more masculine. So yeah, I don't know.
How would you define Jewish femininity? What does it mean, and how do some people misconstrue or misunderstand what Jewish?
Yeah, so I think the first thing is that your soul is not male or female, which I think is very interesting. I heard this from my rabbi recently. The soul is not male or female. The soul is a piece of God, and God is not male or female. The body is male or female. And within that, every single body is masculine and feminine in different measurements, in different amounts. And there's nothing wrong with either. In the Tanakh, even, we have, men who are described as very feminine and women who are described as very masculine. I think the greatest example of this would be Dinah and Yosef, who switched wombs. And so Yosef was supposed to originally be a girl, and Dinah was supposed to originally be a boy. And because of this whole, whatever, not getting into it, Yosef is described as very feminine and Dinah is very masculine, and there's nothing wrong. And they're both very righteous, and they're both, great figures in the Tanakh. So to understand this, it kind of goes into the Kabbalistic concepts of the giver and the receiver. And so the giver is a force which gives infinite potential, and the receiver takes that infinite potential, extracts a bit from it, and creates something that's infinitely greater. And so this can, obviously, you can see how this concept exists within the process of making a child. So there's infinite potential, an extraction of a single within that infinity to make something that is infinitely greater than what it was before. And so that's masculine and feminine. And again, women can be masculine, men can be feminine, and there's no problem with that within Judaism.
Yeah, I think it's very much can be best summarized as like the giver and the receiver or nurturer kind of paradigm. And as you say, the Torah says male and female he created them, and I think that's talking about everyone having male and female aspects within them. But I think, and we can all, and by the way, if we didn't have that, we would find it impossible to understand the opposite gender and other modes of operating. But the question becomes, when you're what's your sort of ikar, what's your base role even though you can manifest both. So that's just the question that people will have to sort of understand and figure out. Like, what's your guiding light? What's your guiding direction?
Yeah, and everyone's an individual, and Judaism's very into being an individual, which I think is so incredible. You know, there's this concept that whatever part of Torah you feel connected to, that's what you should be learning, you know, and that applies for every single person. Again, this whole concept of if you're not being yourself, whether that's on the community level or the individual level, the world is missing out on something. Hashem put you here for a reason, and you're a piece of the puzzle, so to speak.
And would you agree with me that part of the religious world has missed this idea of individual autonomy and self-expression, and that there's we're going a little bit too much into the kind of like one-size-fits-all approach of being religious? Now, I know there are objective standards of halacha and mitzvot, but for example, when it comes to like learning, as you mentioned, a lot of people think like, well, the gold standard or the only thing I should be learning is Gemara. And of course it's important, but there are some people who, I mean, what would have happened? There would be no Rabbi David Foreman, I don't know if you know his stuff with Aleph Beta, produced the most phenomenal content that, I mean, moves me to tears, his level of connections that he finds within the written Torah. And if people aren't encouraged, but some people feel, well, if I'm an expert in Tanakh, or if I'm an expert in a certain area of Jewish thought, or if that's my focus, that's my learning, it's not quite the same as learning Gemara, and other such examples, you know, like
Absolutely.
Like emphasis on, well, does he daven 3 times a day? Well, okay, that matters, but there are lots of people who do that and it's completely by rote, and there are some people who might, let's say, daven extremely sincerely, but they can't get through all of it. And so these these sort of shallow checkboxes that we've created are a bit, I think, stifling and missing the wood for the trees.
For sure. I was actually, earlier this week, I was in a class on the Maharal, and he's literally talking about this exact concept about how he says, like, the yeshivas have got it wrong. They're teaching Gemara too young. They should be teaching it when they're 15, not when they're 7. And, you know, they're forcing people into these boxes, and then these people come out, and when they're young, they get it and they're into it, but then they come out of the yeshiva system and they're empty. And you know, obviously I can't speak on the yeshiva system. I can't speak on the school system. I don't know enough about it, but you know, there is something to be said about if you're, you know, putting someone into a box that they don't necessarily need to be in, you know, you could be taking something away from them. And it's really interesting in Rabbi Yaakov Klein's book, The Story of Our Lives, which is a commentary on The Lost Princess, which is a Rabbi Nachman tale. He talks about how there's this trend of people who are like, they grow up through the yeshiva system, and then they go off the derech and they come back through Chassidut, or something that's a little bit kind of out of the box, so to speak. Not that all Chassidut is out of the box, but they needed a different taste of Torah. They needed a different face of Torah, so to speak, in order to connect to it. And I just, in every community, unfortunately, there's issues. And I think that obviously it's coming from a place of love, that if we don't put them on the right path, then they might stray for some other reason, or we might not get the point across, or they might be missing out on some learning. So I'm not as, you know, I can't speak to why it is the way it is, but I think it's very important that even if you're putting your child into a certain system, that you always tell your children that, you know, Shivim Panim LaTorah, there's 70 faces to Torah, and there are multiple ways to go about this. And if this isn't for you, we'll find what's for you.
Yeah. And it's great that you're aware of that. And it's something that I slowly became aware of on my Jewish journey, that there are some wonderful things about the religious Jewish world. And there are also some things which I think perhaps need a bit of refining or changing, and that's okay. And so I think it's actually more important that people become aware of that. And we're never talking about Judaism, we're just talking about sometimes social norms which have come about through Jewish culture and practice that, you know, can sometimes require a bit of a rethink. I just think it's healthy for people to be aware of that. And actually people who come to it from outside, didn't grow up in that world like you, and like me as well, in some ways we have a bit more of an objective, we have something more objective, I think, to offer, or it might enable us to see things in a slightly more balanced or nuanced way.
Yeah, especially when we come in, we're getting all the love and all the light, and it's like, oh, like Judy's, when people grow up in it, sometimes that's not what they get because they're getting the entire full experience. And I'm sure that Bezrat Hashem in the future, when I have kids and I have a family, and I'm going to be dealing with this stuff too. But there is some that's where you get on fire ballet tshuva, because they're really just getting all the positivity and all the nuance, and because they're coming into it as adults, they're being treated like adults. And sometimes it makes sense that we teach Torah differently to children, but sometimes we don't get past that. And we're just, they're stuck with this childlike view of the Torah and this childlike view of Judaism and God. And once you're older, it doesn't fit anymore.